Weifeng Zhong, Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Welcome to the Data Exchange Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
So you're an economist by training. So you went to graduate school and studied, I guess, econometrics. Is that right?
Actually, not. I study political economy,
Okay.
which is basically a subfield in economics that deal with basically what politics have to do with the economy.
So so we're gonna talk about what you're doing now around the policy change index, but what are some of the classical tools that economists use to do the kind of work that you did in grad school uh, back when you were in school?
So I guess it depends on whether you're talking about theoretical economics or empirical economics. So in theoretical economics, which is the field I was in graduate school, the issues of interest would be basically how voting outcomes are determined. For example, why do we have a two-party system under presidential democracy, and why in, for example, parliamentary democracy you have multiple parties, more than two, or why do we have such a polarized polity in the country? Like why it wasn't that polarized, for example, in the 70s, and why now it's much more polarized. So that kind of theoretical questions are often answered by modeling. So all you need is a piece of paper and pencil. And the other field would be the empirical research,
What do
which
you mean?
largely.
Let me stop you there. So piece of paper and pencil. What do you mean? Like, is it like game theory?
Yeah. So for example, you write down a game, you try to solve for the equilibrium,
Right.
and then you try to see how the equilibrium outcome moves as some underlying parameter moves, and you use that to sort of explain the real world phenomena you are observing.
So this is basically at the level of theorems.
Yeah.
Wow, I didn't realize this existed in political science. So it's
Yeah,
basically
it is.
game. It's basically game theory inside political science.
Correct.
I see. Yeah. And then, like you were saying, there's the empirical side where they do a lot of statistical analysis, right?
Right. And then the major focus there would be to explain to make causal inferences about what causes what in an empirical setting. And there are, so not saying that the two fields don't overlap. So there are a lot of empirical research in the political economy as well for example, to identify whether, for example, whether income inequality would cause in the sense of causal inferences, cause the politics to be more polarized, for example.
So the interesting thing about political science is it's one of those fields where uh, I guess there's a lot of armchair quarterbacking, right? So a lot of amateurs that probably opine and give advice and things like that. But then on the other hand, there's the professional political scientists. Uh, it seems like in recent years, there's more and more quantitative techniques and I, I hate to use the word rigor being applied to not just political science but the social sciences. But on the other hand, there might be also the possibility, Weifeng, of overreach in terms of the quantitative methods. The people in the quant side thinking they have all the answers, right?
Right. So it's the same, I guess, in practice too, right? In for example, in finance, you have all these quant guys in hedge funds, and there's always this fight, I guess, between those who are doing quant research versus the emerging, for example, the machine learning folks, and they debate about what methodology makes more sense. But I think all these are encouraging developments because without these kind of debates, it's hard to see what will perform better.
By the way, one of the books that I really like in this area is this Angris book, Mastering Metrics, which is an overview of kind of applied econometrics, which written in a way that is accessible to basically a practicing data scientist can use some of the techniques, which I recommend. I'm not sure you're familiar with that book.
I heard of that book, but I haven't read it.
Yeah. So when did machine learning begin entering your fields of study?
I think there were some early applications if we are talking about, like, for example, topic modeling, right?
Yeah.
So ever since the LDA came out in 2002 or 2003, there have been some applications, for example, in political science, which tries to analyze text from, for example, coming up from Congress, like floor speeches or press releases to figure out
So, but
topics.
so I think the LDA paper maybe 2001. By the way, I've had David on this podcast, and I'm friendly with both Mike and Andrew as well. So that paper came out in 2001. So when did the social scientists start using some of these techniques? Because I thought that I was fairly early using those techniques. In the early days, you had to go to David's code in Princeton to use it. There weren't accessible libraries, right? So
Yeah. So I guess it really came up later in the 2010s,
okay,
when you have R packages.
I
That
see.
makes it really much easier. Yeah.
Right.
The first time I used it, I think it's back in 2015. I was just playing stuff around, and by that time there was already this structured topic model packages, STM, developed by folks including Professor Molly Roberts. So that's already quite it's already quite advanced in terms of applications in around 2015.
So traditionally, when you think of econometrics, the main data sources tend to be more structured, right? So then you go to text, it's more unstructured. Um, so was topic models the first time people started looking at unstructured data in the social sciences?
That's my impression. Yeah. So that's if you're talking about sort of early adoptions within the field of economics, I think that's if not the earliest, at least one of the earliest.
So what would be some of the first papers that set aside the fact that they applied text mining and topic models, but what were some of the first papers that had results that actually caught the attention of the social scientists? And
I think I have.
what were those results? And what were those results?
So I'm not sure whether this really it stands out in terms of being very early, but I would name on my list, on the top of my list, one of those papers would be the paper, The Impossibility Theorem, result by Kleinberg and his co-authors, showing that, no matter, so for example, this is now a big debate, how to assess whether an algorithm is biased or not. And there are a lot of economic applications, right? For example, to assess credit worthiness, and in criminal justice applications as well. And the very striking result there is that there are many ways to define fairness by algorithms, and it's impossible, for example, long story short, to satisfy all of them.
Yes, exactly.
And so that has some sort of the arrow flavor of the impossibility theorem in welfare economics.
Oh, I see. Interesting. So you yourself, when did you start? So you describe yourself as coming more from this game theoretic school of political science, writing theorems, improving them. So when did you start using empirical methods like text mining and topic models?
It's actually after I started my first job, after I finished graduate school and moved to Washington, D.C. area. And the reason for that was I have long had this fascination about propaganda, because, as you know, I grew up in China. And so coming from China, I have been exposed to a lot of propaganda domestically, right? So, People's Daily is, it's pretty much the major thing that you read. and all these news programs on televisions are to some extent more or less propaganda as well. And so growing up, I was very impressed by how effective propaganda is. Because my first thought would be, people wouldn't believe in this sort of talking point. But in fact, I soon realized I was wrong, because most people in China, they believed in propaganda. So it really impressed on me the fact that so many people actually believe in what the government is saying, and propaganda is really powerful in terms of changing people's behavior through changing their mind. And so even before I came to America, I had this idea that if we could somehow figure out what the Chinese government is saying, we might have a chance to predict what they are thinking, but isn't telling us, right? Or even predict what they would do next. And it's only after I came to America and having finished graduate school that I realized this is actually an idea that's very old in the practice of intelligence analysis in the United States. So not only in the academia, but also in the practice in the CIA for decades, starting from the Second World War. The only difference was that it used to be hard to do, because it used to require human analysts to go through all the propaganda messages and then to analyze them and figure out what they mean. But nowadays with machine learning, it's much easier. And so I found out that I finally have the available tools to reach my childhood dream of analyzing Chinese propaganda. So that's what really got me started. Of course, it's also a natural extension from, back in graduate school, I was studying political science, and studying China was really just a unique, but a specific instance of political science.
So what was your first, what was your first project? And how did you arrive at the set of tools that you ended up using?
So the first project, the big project, was it's already the policy change index. Right? So that's actually my first project, big project on natural language processing. The idea was, I think the people's daily, just like Chinese version of the Pravda, right, or the Pravda for the Chinese government. So the idea I had was that because the publication was so important in terms of propagandizing the government's opinion, that if you could detect changes in how the tone shifts over time, that would have huge indications of what the government might want to do differently going forward. And so the idea I had at the beginning was to see whether we have natural language processing techniques that can help us analyze the Chinese word. And so that's also the time, because I started that project in late 2015, early 2016. And when I launched the Policy Change Index project, it was in late 2018. So it took me about 2 or 3 years figuring that out. And that was also the time when neural network models were fastly arising. So I sort of caught on this trend, fortunately, of all these advances in neural network modeling, and also the continuously declining entry of barriers, so that for somebody like me who didn't know a thing about machine learning, could have the chance to sort of pick ourselves up.
So what are your underlying sources? Are they all official publications of the Chinese government?
Yeah, so the source underlying the policy change index so far for the use cases of China is the People's Daily, the full text of the People's Daily. That's an official publication starting even before the 1949. So before 1949, when the People's Republic was established, the newspaper was already the party newspaper, the Communist Party's official newspaper.
So why limit yourself to only the People's Daily?
Because that's the most authoritative source. So now I have been asked this question many times, that what if you include other newspapers in China? And so the idea, we could if we have it. But the issue is that mixing the maximum, for example, with other numbers would lower the average, right? So the average of many numbers will be lower than the maximum. And the same idea holds here too. If you mix the People's Daily with some less authoritative source in China, that would lower our ability to sort of find out what really represents the government's thinking, because People's Daily, just like Pravda, is under very strict control by the Communist Party, and so it most represents the thinking of the party line.
So take us back to so you discovered that there's now a set of tools that you could apply, and that you now have access to the archive of the People's Daily. So what was the first? What were some of the first findings that got you really excited?
We had the first algorithm we have is called the Policy Change Index for China, which basically tries to assess on a quarterly basis whether the newspaper has shifted its emphasis. So in terms of the priority of content, and more specifically, we train an algorithm to figure out whether a certain article would make it to the front page, right? So that's a very important proxy for something that's important. And so if the Chinese government started to put different things that they didn't used to put on the front page, now put it on the front page, then it would represent they're changing their mind in terms of what's most important for the country, right? And so we used that idea. So the first algorithm we launched back in 2018 was to see whether what they are saying about the trade negotiations with the U.S. and which later became the trade war, right? And so we found out that there's a significant shift toward more hotline talking points in the People's Daily. And that came out right around the time when many folks, including those on Wall Street, was expecting some sort of a trade deal in which China would make those the so-called structural changes to make the concessions to the U.S. trade negotiations, right? So for example, cutting.
Weifeng, give us a sense of, so you're finding this out, so on a daily basis, do you update the policy change index, or is it weekly, or?
We are doing it quarterly for this one.
Oh, quarterly, okay. So it's not like someone from Wall Street can buy a feed of the policy change index and start adjusting their trades accordingly, right?
So one might be able to, one of the things we are thinking about doing down the road is to refine the algorithm so that we could make a higher frequency prediction. So perhaps to upgrade that from to a quarterly to a monthly basis. But we haven't been able to do that because later on we were distracted by other projects, including to predict whether the Chinese military will crack down on Hong Kong protesters. So that one is on a daily basis.
And how good is that model?
So that model tries to see in terms of the language used in the newspaper to describe the Hong Kong protesters, how similar are they to the language used to describe the Tiananmen Square protesters? In which case there was a clear crackdown on June 4th.
Right.
And the language back in 1989, there was a very clear escalation, in the sense that when the students, when they first came out to Tiananmen Square to protest, right? So in the newspaper, they were called demonstrators. And then the newspaper changes the wording, it became protesters, and then became rioters, and then traitors. It gets worse and worse. And all that happened in the month leading up to June 4th. So before June 4th, you could already see those escalations in language. So we try to, in this, what we call the policy change index or crackdown, we try to predict whether on a daily basis, the Chinese military would crack down on Hong Kong protesters. And we basically try to put on each day, does the newspaper, when it comes to Hong Kong protesters, does it look like June 3rd or June 2nd? So how many days away are we from action, basically?
Yeah.
And so the closest last year was when a crackdown was hypothetically 10 days away.
I see.
So it didn't happen in the end, it didn't happen, but we did pick up the ups and downs of the tension in the newspaper.
So for those of us who do not speak Mandarin, although I have traveled quite a bit to China, how does NLP work in Mandarin? Because in English, you know, you tokenize, maybe you have spaces to work with, right? So here's a word, right? So here. But in Mandarin, it's character. So give us a high-level overview of the challenges of NLP in Mandarin.
Yeah, so the first step is segmentation. Like you said, we have different phrases of words, and basically you have to break them up, just like create a hypothetical spaces to break them up. And then but once you get through that, in the space of a work to vector, like for example, like a word embedding space, then everything will be the same, just like any other languages.
I see.
Right. So, but then for segmentation, there are a lot of pre-trained algorithms that can chop words up very efficiently.
So, so you've got you have the model for Hong Kong. Did you and then the trade negotiations? So how do you decide what model to build and what questions to ask? Is that driven by requests from the outside?
So yeah, so we got a lot of feedback after we have launched the product line under the policy change index. And sometimes people wonder, oh, like last year, right? Oh, are they going to crack down on Hong Kong protesters? Or this year, we run into interesting questions about how bad really was the COVID-19 in China. They say all these numbers, but nobody believed them. So how exactly how serious it really was, and so because of this interest, we sometimes realize the old techniques are not sufficient enough to make the new predictions. So we make new models. And so this year we also made a new product, what we call the PCI outbreak algorithm, which again, like the crackdown on Hong Kong protesters, we try to assess on a daily basis how serious COVID-19 in China really was. And we do that by learning from the past, the 2003 SARS outbreak in China. So we try to learn how the government's language changes as an outbreak runs through its course. So then you can sort of pick up the wax and wane, so to speak, of the language.
So give us a sense of, so the People's Daily is your primary source. So how widely read is the People's Daily?
The People's Daily, by choice, is not very widely read.
Yeah.
Especially because of the economic reform. So after the economic reform started in late 70s, the readership of the People's Daily has drastically declined because of other more market-driven newspapers and TV channels, for example. But that really is what makes it still important, because it means that they are still towing the party line very tightly, right? And because if they really answer to the market demand, their readership in terms of the market competition would not have gone down so much. And so in that sense, it's still important. And another point is that government officials in China, they are often, when they go to work every day in the morning, the newspaper of the People's Daily will be lying on their desk. So they pretty much have to read it, which again makes it ever more important to for the newspaper to be authoritative in terms of signaling the party's intent.
So if you were to add more data sources, what would you add? Would it be a broadcast media where you take whatever, what's CCTV, and then transcribe speech to text and then do the same analysis? Or what other data sources are you considering?
I think there are a lot of exciting opportunities. If you think about the news broadcast on CCTV every night at 7, right? So you can also try to analyze what makes it to, for example, the first 5 minutes versus the second 5 minutes or the second half.
So where would you? So in the People's Daily case, you could access the archives. So for CCTV, would there be such a thing as an archive somewhere?
I think I heard of I'm not sure exactly where, but somebody mentioned to me that the transcribed broadcast actually exists. So one could actually use it. And by the way, I should stress that everything under the PCI project is open source. So if anyone has their own data, they want to try it out, even official newspapers of other countries, they can use the code as well.
And so how specific are the models and the data pipelines obviously have to be specific because it's Mandarin, but once you have the word embeddings, how specific are the models to China?
It's not specific at all. So after you have the word embedding, the model we have for example, for the China, the quarterly project, the language model is just a form of recursive neural network. So what we use is the gated recurrent unit, GRU, off-the-shelf application. The really new thing there was, oftentimes the challenge to applying machine learning models is the lack of labels, right? Lack of training data. And so in our case, we actually take the metadata column of the front page as the label. And so we don't have to invest any time in putting together training data set because it's already there. And it so happens that the page number or whether some content is on the front page or not is hugely important in this case, right? And so that's why you can also think of the news broadcast on television, for example, whether certain content makes it into the first 5 minutes or first 3 minutes would be hugely important as well.
So is there an official Weibo account for the People's Daily? And for our listeners, Weibo is the equivalent of Twitter.
There is. And funny you mentioned that because there's an interesting subtle difference between the print and web appearance of the newspaper. And it seems that the government is very careful in terms of choosing what to put on the website or not, or put on the social media or not. There are certain things that they didn't want to say on print media, but they wanted to say it on the internet. Recall, I think 2.5 years ago, when China voted with other nations in the UN Security Council to sanction North Korea. So the North Korean government got really mad around that time. So they attacked the Chinese government, saying, you're betraying socialism, you're tearing down the pillar of the Chinese North Korean friendship. So they say all these things. And so the People's Daily actually fought back, but they didn't fight back on the print version. They fought back on the Weibo version. So that would be an interesting application to see the difference between print versus web.
Yeah, it's I think you guys should probably, because the Weibo account probably is also very, very carefully monitored and guarded as to what gets posted there, right?
Right. So the difference is very interesting, but it's not unique to China. We also, one of the other countries we are exploring to cover under PCI in the future is for Cuba. And so when we were looking at the Cuban newspaper, which is called Grandma, the boat Fidel Castro famously took to fought the Revolutionary War. If you look at the web versus the print version, there are some subtle differences there as well. And obviously the purpose was the Cuban people are not having any access to internet anyway. So the difference is really what appeals to foreign audiences versus domestic audiences.
So does the policy change index, do you have specific models that monitor different segments of information? So there's a model that figures out what the government is saying about business and the economy. There's a model that monitors what the government is saying about foreign policy.
So far we don't have that capability, but this is also one of the things we are trying to work on for the future, to have a subject, a topic level index to indicate the change. And it could be done. There are several ways to do it. So one, for example, if one is interested in foreign policy, one way to do it is to include the Global Times, which is more foreign policy leaning.
Global Times is even, from what I understand, is really over the top, right?
It's over the top. And so that brings in another question. So by the way, all these discussions are beyond the nature of machine learning, right? It's about whether certain techniques is applicable and what we can find, what we can conclude from the findings. And so on the subject of global times, the issue is how representative is global times to the
government,
government's intent in terms of the foreign policy.
And what's the anecdotal assessment there? Is it very representative?
I don't know. So I have the impression that sometimes they are too over the top than the central government would desire. Especially in recent months, they are even in their news conferences, they are very combative. But then, for example, one day you see a very combative news conference by the foreign ministry, but then the next day you see the Chinese ambassador to the U.S. saying something something softer. Right? So it's an indication of the lack of a unified voice, to say the least, right? So, but which one most represents the central government's foreign policy? It's a judgment call.
What's the in terms of the technology and the model? So what's on your to-do list in terms of future versions of the policy change index?
We have many ideas.
If you had infinite resources, infinite number of engineers, what are the things that you would like to do?
So there are several things we are really excited to do. First is to implement better versions of language models. We have already done that in some products. For example, the latest algorithm on the outbreak, the COVID-19 outbreaks in China, we have implemented the BERT algorithm for the Chinese text. And so we could, in the future, down the road, implement that across the product line as well. So an upgrade from GRU to BERT is a possibility. I'm also very interested in extending the application to other issues and other countries. So within China, there are other applications, for example, to predict whether I don't know, one of the hot issues now is whether China and India would clash on the border, right? So, and interesting thing, it happened before.
But you're not, so with that particular example, Weifeng, you're still keeping the same data. So all you're going to do then is what? How do you point the policy change index to that particular topic? What does that entail?
So the issue there, the approach will be very similar. So there are historical episodes in which you can learn how language changes as during the course of certain historical events. Right? So China and India fought the border war in 60s, and so you can go back and learn how the language changes before.
But 1960, you had Chairman Mao. Now you have Xi Jinping. Doesn't the language change?
It could. So one of the interesting findings, though, we have on the outbreak project. So you could say the same on the outbreak project as well, because back in SARS, the Chinese president was Hu Jintao, right? But now it's Xi Jinping. And back in SARS, the outbreak happened at the beginning in Guangdong, and now it's in Wuhan. And so the locations are different too. But it turns out that didn't really matter. So what we find is that the episode-specific characteristics, including difference in who's the president and where the outbreak is, even after we took that into account, the result is not changing as much. So one could have the confidence. I'm not guaranteeing result, of course, because we haven't done the
so
India
you take the China-India thing, then so what you need to do is go back in time and carefully understand how language was used in the past. Is that what you're saying?
Mm-hmm. Right, and then we can try to monitor whether the language is changing in a similar way.
So that first part where you're looking at the past, is that a heavily manual process?
So in COVID-19 project, when we compare it to SARS, it's not very heavily manual project, because we try to. So on that project, just like the application on the Hong Kong protest, we are trying to learn the date an article was published.
But then walk me through the kind of the stages of building something like this. So in the SARS case, then first isolate all of the articles that mention SARS. Is that right? And then analyze the language of those articles, and then you can and then you must apply some kind of external knowledge in the sense that you know that okay, so this is how language evolved over time, but I know that in this point in time SARS spiked, and then I kind of annotate and figure out, okay, so this is how they were talking about it when it spiked. So you have to apply some kind of external knowledge, right?
Right. So what we are trying to claim here is that machine learning is not going to replace altogether subject matter expertise. It's never meant to be, right? But what it helps is to take care of what used to be labor-intensive tasks.
Yeah, give subject matter experts superpowers, basically.
Exactly. So the subject matter judgment here is that it's the fundamental assumption that the way the Chinese government used to talk about SARS is still the way they're now talking about COVID. Now, the words might be slightly different, but the way they approach propaganda in terms of a public health crisis remains the same, because the Chinese regime remains largely the same in terms of how they handle propaganda.
And so what were some of the things that you were able to take advantage of from the SARS episode?
So from the SARS episode, what we are able to take advantage of is the fact that there's a very clear cycle of outbreak in SARS, starting from early 2013 to about July, when basically the whole world was declared by the WHO as SARS-free, right? And of course, it came back in 2004 in Beijing, but that's another outbreak. So the fact that there was a clear vaccine wane in terms of a more what looks like a normal distribution gives us a sense to approximate severity with time. And so now when we see some COVID articles, we can see, oh, which point in time between early to the summer of 2003 does it look like? Does it look like around the peak, or does it look like toward the end of the tail?
So, but in many ways, it's hard to validate.
It is hard to validate. So, for example, the only chance we really could validate a timeline matching exercise we had was on the Hong Kong project, when we tried to see, for example, Hong Kong, it's not the first time Hong Kong had a protest last year. It happened in 2014 when they had this umbrella movement, right? And so also protesters gathered in 2014, and the important fact is that the crackdown did not happen, right? So what we were able to do is to validate the true negative, meaning that we did not predict a crackdown would happen, and it didn't happen in 2014. And so now it looks like we have another true negative, for example, because last year it didn't happen either, or this year when it came back after the national security law, it didn't happen either. But to really validate, for example, it would take another real crackdown to have a chance to validate the true positive, though.
So what about Weifeng, the speeches that the Chinese diplomats give in the UN? Is that another good data source?
Depends on what issues you are.
Because isn't that's probably also very carefully written, right?
Right. So from there, yeah. So for example, speeches at UN or all these other major international organizations, right? WTO is a hugely combated issue now, or WHO, right? And so one might be able to pick up trends of how the Chinese government approaches this kind of international organization. There's a lot of debate about, or a complaint really about the Chinese trying to take over the control of these organizations, and how exactly were they doing it, or when did they start doing this, would be very interesting and hugely important as well.
So there's two major issues in my mind that would be interesting to figure out if there's any patterns you're detecting. The first one, having grown up in Southeast Asia, would be the South China Sea. And then the second one is Xinjiang province. Are those two topics ones that you folks are monitoring? And then in which case, it seems like your methodology relies on kind of a previous episode that you could kind of anchor. So what would be the anchors in these two cases?
So we don't have good anchors for, well, when it gets to day-by-day predictions, it is true that we need an anchor from the past. So in Hong Kong versus Tiananmen Square, COVID versus SARS, in that sense, we don't have any anchor for South China Sea or Xinjiang province. But we did have, excuse me, we have indeed picked up changes surrounding the quarterly priorities of the government's policies. More specifically, in the second quarter of this year, which ended in June, we have detected a significant shift toward the military issues. So the issues surrounding the Chinese military. Now, it means that in going forward, the Chinese government may put more attention in terms of military. Whether it's would there be a small-scale war? We don't know, and where exactly it might be, we don't know. But there certainly the South China Sea is a candidate. Taiwan is another candidate too, especially now that the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company is getting so large in their market share, and then they are basically like the Middle East for computers, right? And so that would be possibly a center of tension in the U.S.-China relations very soon.
So what has the reception been in China of your work? Can you still enter China?
So I have not tried that, not by my intention. It just happens that I haven't gone back to China recently. But what we do know, though, is that the Chinese media, state-controlled media, have already talked about the PCI project. One of their state-controlled outlets has talked about it. And so since the PCI project is monitoring them, now we know that they know that we are monitoring them, right? And by the time this podcast airs, right, I guess the entire world knows that we know that they know that we are monitoring them.
Right. And so what about here domestically? Have policymakers or people in federal government or even Wall Street, so who have expressed interest in your work?
So our project has been demonstrated to many different types of users, including government users, like you said. And also, so basically we run a monthly newsletter under the Policy Change Index. So in which we'll update our users what new projects we have done and what new findings we have about the next movement of the Chinese government. And we have users in academia, in the industries, in finance, in government as well.
So finance, I would expect that their main request is we want more frequency and cadence, right?
Likely, yeah. So exactly how they use this, we know that they are our audience. Exactly how they use it for their own purposes, we don't know.
So because the Policy Change Index uses the People's Daily, does that mean now you've personally become much more of a People's Daily fan?
So the point now, I have long been their fan growing up, not of actually reading it too much, but of the importance.
Yeah,
I was always impressed by how.
But now you literally know everything on there, right?
Well, the point of leveraging AI is that I still didn't have to. Now, so to this day, I still don't read the People's Daily on a day-to-day basis because I have an algorithm to do that.
So what's next in terms of, so you mentioned possibly pointing your tools to other countries. Are your tools specifically, so it seems like it's not necessarily just going to be applicable in policy and political science, right?
Right. So in the sense that it's the key idea of the project is that sometimes we may in our data set have some important metadata column which we are interested in, and which by applying the algorithm we can detect how they shift over time. Right? So if you think about, if you have a large data set of text, for example, speeches, and if you have the author who made that speech or who wrote that speech, then you can predict whether content would, so certain authors, they shift their opinion over time. Now, if you think about, like for example, if you think about the judiciary, right? So if you collect all the opinions written by judges, and let's say you train an algorithm to predict who said what, right? And then applying the same algorithm will allow you to figure out whether a conservative judge is making a statement or writing opinion pieces that are moving toward the left, or a liberal judge is moving toward a more conservative direction. And so it doesn't really restrict us to the subject matter of political science, although this is my my interest has always been political science, so that's why. But one could easily use that in other use cases as well.
So how has since you've been since you left grad school and now you built this policy change index, so let's close with this. So how do you think the study of political science and social science is going to be affected by all of these tools?
I think this huge change is underway in academia, in social sciences, although it's lacking a little bit of commercial how fast it has moved in a commercial area. But I think for research purposes, we have seen more and more papers these days applying machine learning algorithms, especially in political science. But I think economics as well. So I'm hopeful that this will become a new trend in the literature and have more and more impact in academic research.
But then this will have to be driven by the young assistant professors, right? Because the full professors may not be up to speed with some of these newer methods, right?
Perhaps, but I am, however, very impressed by how low the entry barrier now is to get your hands on with machine learning algorithms. Like I didn't know anything about that when I was in graduate school, but it doesn't mean that it's not very easy to pick up now. Right. I imagine in the future the entry barrier might be even lower.
Right. And with that, thank you, Weifeng, and we'll make sure we post the links to all of your projects. And I encourage all our listeners to check out the Policy Change Index. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me, Ben.